Hi, my name is Dina, and I'm going to be exploring three main topics that surround the executive branch of governance. This is a fundamental topic to divulge into since the underlying theme of this study is relevant due to the fact that public finance and accounting has relevance for us all in our day-to-day lives. Due to this, political and official aspects will be scrutinized, but also the public bodies who commence these activities and the publics, you and I for instance, for whom the government's activities have social, cultural, political and economic importance. And lastly, for being Christchurch-based residents, it is all the more important as there are numerous governmental activities occurring as we speak. So the first area we're going to be looking at is taxation and appropriation. So taxation, according to Medeo, is a non-penal yet compulsory transfer of wealth from the private sector to the public sector, levied without receipt of a special benefit of equal value and on the basis of predetermined criteria enforced to accomplish some sort of a nation's economic and social objective. Taxation in New Zealand is collected on a national level by the Inland Revenue on behalf of the New Zealand government. National taxes are levied on business income and personal income, as well as GST, goods and service income. In the 1980s, New Zealand went through a series of major tax reforms, and there were some issues that were derived from the effect of these reforms, including business taxes and effects on productivity and competitiveness in New Zealand's market. Namely, this was the survival of smaller companies in New Zealand. There was a thought process linked with would they be able to survive if the tax rate were to increase. And also differences in treatments of certain types of investments, to invest in a certain type of investment just based on the lowest tax rate that they would have to pay. And lastly, international tax rules. There was a strong need for facilitation of international trade, and double tax agreements were developed between New Zealand and other countries to support this cause. So in these very simple examples, one can come to grips with how much of an effect a tax reform can have in our lives. So how do you tax fairly? Well, John Hampton said, "What an English king has no right to demand, an English subject has a right to refuse." This all stemming from the idea of no taxation without representation. So the idea of taxation is that there is a public benefit, but there is a compulsion. There are some risks that can arise from this: oppression, abuse of power to levy or collect tax. There's also breaches of maxims of taxation. For example, there are maxims associated with tax including equity, certainty, convenience, and economy. And if any of these are compromised, then that tax does become somewhat arbitrary. Well, in New Zealand, the rule of law can actually prevent against these risks. Law and chains of responsibility are actually developed to prevent against these risks, to exclude the existence of arbitrariness or even wide discretionary authority on behalf of the government. There is a responsibility on ministers to use their best endeavors to protect the integrity of the tax system without limiting its meaning. The integrity of the tax system includes the taxpayer's perception of that integrity. So that's just linking back to what I said just before about trust and confidence in the system is lost if there was an oppression, if there was an abuse of power. That is all stemming from no taxation without representation. So there's a lot of accountability involved. That was all about taxation and the process of it within New Zealand. Now moving on to appropriation. An appropriation is a parliamentary authorization for the allocation of resources to a minister for a specified purpose. So essentially you could say it is a budgetary practice. According to Andrew Goddard, the budgetary system was found to be the most important organizational process with regards to accountability. So within my research, I've had a look at how this budgetary practice actually is done within New Zealand. Essentially, there are 7 steps that will eventually lead to the enactment of the appropriation bill. Number 1 is a strategic phase where the minister drafts a budget for the upcoming 3 years. Step 2 is preparation of vote budgets, where the minister and the chief executives draft a budget for the upcoming year and purchase agreements. Step 3 is development of the budget initiatives, where the ministers within their departments work out how to impact revenue. Step 4 is a review of budget baselines, where the ministers keep expenses for each votes within approved levels. Step 5 is consideration of proposed budget initiatives, where the cabinet reviews the ministers' proposals. Step 6 is the production of the actual document for the budgets, and this is when the Minister of Finance presents this to the House of Representatives. Step 7 is the passing of the appropriation bill. When it is read a 3rd time in the courts, it is actually passed as a law with the assent of the Governor General. So that was just a quick explanation to how the budgetary practice of appropriation happens, and it is done within a certain chain of responsibility in mind. So the last topic that was discussed was taxation and appropriation. This week's topic is going to be chains of responsibility and accountability. So a simple definition of accountability is the obligation of an individual or an organization to account for its activities, take responsibility for them, and to disclose the results in a transparent manner. It also includes the responsibility for money or other entrusted property. So just backtracking from the first topic that we spoke about, which was the taxation topic, it was mentioned that there was a certain type of separation of powers. In New Zealand, this is the following system that exists. There's a role of Parliament or legislature, who basically passes the law and represents the people. And then there's a role for the executive, develops and pursues policy and acts as ministers of the crown. And then there's a role of courts, a judiciary role to interpret and apply statute, as well as interpreting common law. So just back to accountability. According to Sinclair, accountability is a cherished sort of concept. It is socially construed and is subjective according to its context. Sinclair identifies 5 forms of accountability. The first one is political accountability. This is where the officer exercises authority on behalf of elected representatives. A direct chain of responsibility links the public servant to the top management level, or the CEO, who is in turn accountable to the minister, to the executive cabinet, to Parliament, and hence the electors. However, this straight line relationship bears only slight resemblance to what actually happens in reality. Number 2 is public accountability. Public accountability involves answering through various mechanisms to a concern about administrative activity, for instance. Number 3 is a managerial accountability. This involves a hierarchy in which the superior calls to account their subordinate for the performance of delegated duties. In particular, managerial accountability is seen to focus on inputs and outputs, which is a point that I will be talking about later on in the video. Number 4 is the professional accountability. Being professionally accountable involves representing the professional values of the group to a skeptical part of government, for instance. And number 5 is personal accountability. This represents pretty basic principles in acting in accordance with the idea that what we will be doing can and will affect others. The first article I was able to get hold of was an article with relation to the CTV building that had collapsed in the devastating February earthquake. was regarding the Minister of Building having a very strong opinion about the engineer who had carelessly identified the CTV building as able to withstand an earthquake, which later came to be clear that it was not at all. I'm just going to go ahead and quote a little section from the article. It had become apparent after the collapse of the CTV building that the accountability regime was woefully inadequate. What I came to realize is when people come to see a situation like that, they don't necessarily want justice in that just one situation. They want to ensure justice in future endeavors as well, for the engineer not to suffer any penalties or jail time. People felt robbed of their right to accountability because people ultimately feel entitled to accountability. And when that entitlement is not met, trust and confidence in the system dissipates. Trust is lost in the power of governments to remedy future situations, which could result in a drop in complying to law. In another article that I found, it was less an unknown engineer and more a very public body. This is a fairly recent example, just in March 2014. The education minister had used money that was dispatched for the trust of education that will go towards children, but it never reached them. She had used business cards for expensive dresses and accommodation and the like. And to contrast these two articles that engender similar themes, incompetence as a politician and purchasing expensive dresses seems to be taken more seriously than an engineer whose decision had ultimately killed 110 people in an earthquake. An interesting point which I have learned. Now, as this course encompasses the public sector more than anything, I found a helpful article by Rutherford that encompasses types of public sector organizations, and they are listed as 4. So in conclusion, a system of chains of responsibility ensures that accountability is kept. And with regards to the public sector bodies, it seems that they are accountable for particular activities rather than accountability for overall results, which is what was observed in the second article that was presented with regards to the Ministry of Education. Because ultimately the public sector bodies are constrained to produce the level of services that their constituents desire. This week we're going to move on to financial and performance accounting. What performance and financial accounting aims to do is to keep records of capital expenditure and also keeping records on how the expenditure is being used. It consists of budget-related reports, statement of financial position, and statement of performance. It focuses on scientific accountability, efficient use of resources, and effective response to crisis. It assumes no corruption or conflict of interest. However, it assumes that the preparer is a steward, essentially. It is criticized for overlooking qualitative data and the process of being too submerged in quantitative data. In New Zealand, there has been major financial management reforms. In a 1995 article by Pallet, hope I'm saying it right, outlines 4 specific phases of these reforms. The first phase being named the traditional phase, which is prior to 1708. During this phase, cash accounting and controls over input were characteristics. The second phase is the managerialist phase, 78 to 85, introducing private sector management techniques, and most importantly, accrual accounting into the public sector organizations, with accrual accounting being, of course, recognizing when economic events occur, regardless of whether cash is incurred. And thirdly, there was a marketization phase characterized by self-interest and competitiveness in markets. And this phase was between 86 and 91. And fourthly, this is a phase that put an effort to focus on the longer term and to overcome the fragmentation that the marketization phase created.